Chapter 26. After a couple of miles of walking down a nearly empty road, lit only by the full moon and with no stars overhead, before the lights of the gas station begin to show in the distance, Erin moves in closer and clings tightly to Jeremy's arm. The night around them just came into focus, in contrast to the bright lights of the gas station. Her unease is starting to show. Jeremy releases from her grip and puts his arm around her shoulder, pulling her in very close to himself. Looking up at him, she watches as his gaze stays forward, and they keep walking toward the brightness of the gas station. Jeremy's eyes wade back and forth between the gas station and the street light to his left as they continue on down the road. Noticing this happen multiple times, Erin tries to look back, but is halted swiftly by Jeremy with a tug of her body into his. "What's wrong?" she asks, looking up at his nervous face, his eyes jumping about. He tightens his face and shakes his head slowly, trying to comfort her. After bringing her tighter to his body, Jeremy nestles his cheek into the top of her head. Her cheeks, already rosy from the cold, grow brighter red as a smile spreads across her face. Moving his head slowly down to her neck, below her hair, he gently presses his lips against her skin. She shivers a little as he slides his lips across the surface of her neck and up to her ear, moving his mouth closer and closer until it gently presses against her skin once more. "They're following us," he whispers, and her eyes widen intensely. "There's a car behind us, a little bit down the road, with its lights off," he continues, and Erin begins to turn her head. "Don't!" he whispers loudly. "We don't want them to know we know they're there." "Who is it?" Erin asks, looking up at Jeremy's eyes, her eyes emitting intense fear for which Jeremy has no solace. So he thinks for a minute for words to comfort her, but no answer springs to mind and he remains silent. All he can do is shake his head slowly, watch as the fear grips her all the more tightly in its dark cloak. Coming up on the gas station now, they both feel the calm cradle of safety, which lies just within its large glass windows. They walk quickly past the pumps and toward the doors, leading inside. Upon reaching their goal, Erin reaches out and tugs on the door's handle. It doesn't move. Her face twists in fear as she pushes and pulls with all of her might. Over and over again, she tries to open the large glass door without an inch of movement in either direction. With panic sinking into her, Jeremy grabs her by the shoulder and points to the sign on the door with an arrow pointing to the left reading, "Please use other door." Reaching over to the door to their left, he opens said door and leads an embarrassed Erin inside by her hand. They walk past the first few aisles and toward the cooler built into and spanning the entire back wall. Jeremy turns to the register on the left side of the station and is welcomed by a bright smile from an elderly man behind the counter. He smiles back and he continues to follow Erin into the cooler. They come to the third door from the end, which holds the fruit, soft, and energy drinks. They each grab as many cans as they can hold in their hands, and while struggling not to drop anything, they make their way toward the counter, watched over by the elderly man. 3 steps closer, and Jeremy finally realizes the hooded figure standing in the back corner watching them. He ignores it, and they pay for their goods. The old man smiling the whole time, but not saying one word more than the price they owe. "I used all my money at the diner." Jeremy turns to Erin. His cheeks burn red with shame of having her pay. Erin smiles and reaching into her pocket grabs $20, which more than covers the cost. "Don't worry about it. It's my turn anyway," she smiles as she pays the old man. He gives them their change and the bags containing their drinks with a large smile, pulling the loose skin drooping from his face tight against the bones underneath. After Erin pushes change down into her pocket, they thank the old man and head for the door. As the two of them take their steps out of the glass door, Jeremy is shoved from behind. He stumbles and hits the ground hard, skinning the palms of his hands, and probably his knee, which is now throbbing, but unseen under his pants. Turning around with haste, He sees the hooded figure standing above him in the doorway. "You son of a bitch!" the hooded figure barks. "We all know it's you doing this," he continues as he steps closer to Jeremy, who is picking himself up off the ground with the help of Erin. The figure removes his hood and Jeremy recognizes him from school. It takes him a second to fully realize who the kid is, but he finally remembers the boy's name. It's Richard, and he knows him from Mr. Sampson's class. He's the blonde kid who sits in the opposing corner from him in the classroom. "Stop it!" screams Erin as she runs up and grabs Richard's arm. Shaking her off with little effort, he pushes her against the wall, knocking her hard to the ground. Jeremy, now at his feet, runs headlong into Richard and tackles the kid hard to the ground and begins slamming his fist viciously into Richard's face with all of his strength. Over and over again he strikes Richard as his hands begin to throb. It only takes a few moments for Jeremy to feel two sets of arms reach around him from behind and pull him off the blonde kid, who now lays bleeding profusely on the ground. His golden hair now being dyed crimson, as red rivers flow down both sides of his face, from his nose, mouth, and eye. Looking up, he notices it's Detective Forrest and an unfamiliar officer. Richard, seeing his chance, gets up and quickly makes his way down the street and into the darkness, as fast as he can. The unknown officer begins after him, but is stopped by Forrest as Richard disappears into the night. "Let him go. He started it and got what was coming to him," he says before turning his attention toward Jeremy and continuing on. "You alright?" he asks. "I'm fine," Jeremy answers. He then looks up at Erin, who is just starting to stand up. Rushing over, he gently helps her to her feet. Her first couple of steps are awkward, but it isn't long at all before she is able to shake away the pain she feels in her legs. They both begin to walk over to the officers, but Jeremy looks beyond the officers and sees the car they had arrived in. Recognizing it as the same car that had followed them there, he stops himself and Erin from moving any closer. "Why were you following us?" Jeremy asks. Erin looks at the car and then nervously at the officers. Mr. Pearson, we weren't following you. We just happened to be in the neighborhood." Detective Forrest smiles and takes another step closer. Jeremy can sense it in his voice and false smile that he is lying. Jeremy knows that he can no longer trust this man. If these cops get in the way of the plan, then something bad might happen. Being that he needs to stay awake, he knows he just cannot be taken in right now. "Why were you patrolling with your headlights off?" Jeremy asks. "That doesn't make much sense, does it?" he continues, looking suspiciously at the two detectives. Neither man says a word, and they just look at each other for a moment. Jimmy feels quite uneasy, and is finding himself becoming more and more fearful of the two men in long coats before him. With very little sleep, a lot of caffeine, and fear flowing through his veins, he makes a hasty decision, and against his better judgment, he grabs Erin's hand and begins to run. He tries with all his might to get himself and Erin away from these two men, but trying to drag the poor girl with him slowed him quite a bit. This was not something that had run through his mind, and it isn't long before he is tackled and lets go of Erin's hand as not to drag her down with him. The unknown officer holds him down, cuffs him, and begins to read Jeremy his rights. Forrest sketches up quickly and helps Jeremy to his feet. "Jeremy, we were going to do this nicely and with care," Forrest says, shaking his head and clearly out of breath. "Why did you run?" he asks, leaning over and breathing really hard to try to pull oxygen into his lungs as the other officer leads Jeremy back to the car. Jeremy hangs his head low and says nothing. Erin follows behind, and as Jeremy is thrown in the back of the car, she begins to cry. "He didn't do anything!" she screams to Forrest as his partner closes the door behind Jeremy. "If that's true," Forrest responds, making his way up to the car, "then he has nothing to worry about." He goes on as he gets into the car and closes the door behind himself. "Jeremy," he says as he situates himself in the driver's seat, "if you hadn't have run, this would not have been necessary." He calls to the back seat with honest regret in his voice. "Yeah," the other officer calls back. "What an idiot this kid is," he continues on, getting nothing in return but an unhappy look from his partner. Not to be disrespected, the unknown detective fires a fierce look back at Forrest. "Remember," he states, "you're the rookie, not me," as he points his index and middle finger at Forrest's head. coming within inches of making contact with his wrinkled brow. As they begin to pull away, Jeremy hears Erin call out from beyond the car's boundaries. "I'll meet you at the police station," she shouts as Jeremy turns his head to look out the rear window and sees her holding up the bag she is carrying. "And I'll bring these." The car pulls away and Jeremy watches out the rear window as Erin's teary face slowly fades into the darkness. It takes all he can to not let himself fall asleep as the streetlights tick past like the watch of a hypnotist, putting him into a trance. It's the longest car ride of his entire life. He only focuses on the pain from the beating he just delivered in his hands, and the hurt in his knees and chest from the tackle he just received to keep himself conscious. Thank you for listening. If you're enjoying the story and how it's going, please subscribe so you can get every chapter as it comes through. Discuss in the comments, plot threads, and where you think the story's going. Share with anybody you think might find it interesting. Until then, I'll see you next video.